Hello, Alexandra here. This content is for folks interested in spiral dynamics or integral, and today I'm going to talk about becoming whole. This is referring to the psycho-spiritual work we do on ourselves. We include the psychological work and reaching out to resources and integrating parts of ourselves that have been split off and working on ourselves to become more whole and as part of our spirituality. So, what could cause different parts of ourselves to be split off? I'm using the word parts and not the word shadow. Parts is a kinder, softer word and can be very specific and useful. So, for example, parts of ourselves that can be split off, we look back to our childhood and knowing that no family is perfectly functional, and we're all from a dysfunctional family, at least in some aspects to some extent, we can look at our upbringing to see how it affected us and what remaining integrations we need in order to feel more whole, feel more at peace, feel more authentic, and help ourselves move through the stages more easily, face our challenges more easily. So, one thing that is very common is growing up, we can develop, to a large extent or to a small extent, a false self for a couple of different reasons. We may be raised in a family where we are encouraged to share the parent's interests and do what the parent values. And we notice as kids that we are very much rewarded for following the interests of the parent, if they value sports or if they value music or if they value academics, and we're very much praised for our achievements in those areas. And in fact, achievement may be the way we get attention and feel love, not necessarily unconditional love. And again, this happens to different extents in different families and with different parents. But to an extent, in all families, kids just want attention and approval. So they also might be ignored or minimized, or even in some families criticized for liking something, caring about something, or interests that the parents don't care about. And when we go deeper into a more dysfunctional family, we have not just parts of our authenticity that can be split off and that we need to reclaim as we grow up, and especially at stage green. That's where we really start wanting to be deeply, deeply authentic. Of course, that can start at an earlier stage, but stage green is known for its deep value of the authentic self. But we have situations where maybe we have some shame, guilt, or anxiety sort of hardwired into our system. That's another way of saying parts. We just have parts of ourselves that are triggered into shame, guilt, or anxiety, perhaps for putting ourselves first. Maybe not in all areas, but maybe in certain areas. Maybe as a kid our separateness and our assertiveness might have been discouraged or even punished. And so we may have, in certain areas, and this is all of us to some extent in some areas. Obviously, there's a huge continuum of the intensity of feelings that we might feel, but we might put ourselves first, and that might trigger a little bit of guilt, or we might find ourselves dealing with folks. It could be anywhere, in the family, at work, anybody we run into in a situation of falsely blaming us for something, and we really feel and we know that we didn't do anything and this person is overreacting, and yet that still might trigger a little bit of guilt. And our mind knows we're being falsely blamed, yet the body where our parts live is still feeling the guilt. So that's why parts work is so, so, so useful, because sometimes we are triggered and we can't, quote unquote, fix it with our mind just by thinking about it. So, whether it's an extreme amount of emotion or just sort of a mild amount of emotion that's sort of getting in the way of having an optimal life, we can reach out to a professional and do the parts work and integrate and heal these parts of ourselves that are feeling this false guilt or this false shame or being triggered into anxiety, where the anxiety we're feeling over a situation might be disproportionate to the actual situation. So, to an extent, a lot of us, all of our parents are perfectly imperfect. And so maybe you had a more extreme parent with narcissistic tendencies. Doesn't have to be full-blown narcissistic personality disorder or full-blown borderline personality disorder. But in some areas, as a child, your assertion of your selfhood, which differed from your parents' values, may have been treated as a betrayal of the parent. And so there can be more parts of yourself split off because of that, because you learned maybe to keep your head down in certain areas and keep your mouth shut, and this kind of dysfunctional parent may have been unnecessarily angry or unnecessarily blaming, because they were dictating the meaning and falsely interpreting your actions, not based in reality. And so you might feel guilty sometimes in some situations for setting a boundary, especially if that other person pushes back on the boundary. It might sort of trigger something from your childhood. There's the saying, first you set a boundary and then you've got to go on to boundary patrol, because often when we set new boundaries with folks in life, they might push back a little bit because they're simply not used to that boundary being there. And just because they dislike your boundaries doesn't mean you are guilty. We want to consider the source, but yet perhaps when we are mentally considering the source, maybe the person you needed to set a boundary with is a family member and they had an unhealthy, disapproving reaction to your healthy boundary. Maybe parts of us are still being triggered, even though we know in our mind that the other person is unhealthy. And so all of these parts, these embodied parts where these feelings are coming up, and we can't, quote unquote, talk ourselves out of these feelings, really respond well to parts therapy, to EDMR, to brain spotting, which is sort of an updated derivative of EDMR. In brain spotting, you don't move your eyes, you just look at one fixed point to intensify that trigger, and then through the process you release the trigger, meaning you integrate the part that had the emotional reaction. And I know a lot of people that had a fantastic relationship with one parent, but the other parent, sometimes they were tiptoeing around that other person's moods, that other parent's moods. So then you're maybe overly other-centric, or you maybe haven't been able to fully express yourself and develop all of your authentic parts yet, simply because you have some parts work to clean up. And this is an ongoing process. It's not one and done. We have many, many, many parts, and it's just human nature. It is just the way we're wired. It is just what happens in childhood. Everybody has parts. If someone says they have no issues whatsoever, I would highly question that. Sometimes some of the earlier stages can maybe suppress their feelings and their issues a little bit. So when we start getting to stage green and beyond stage green is maybe where we really relish inner work as a way of life. But you may already be familiar with all the different roles we can play in dysfunctional families. And again, on a continuum, dysfunction on a continuum. You have mild dysfunction, a lot of dysfunction, and of course, years ago I did ask my counselor about post-traumatic stress. Does everyone have some degree of post-traumatic stress? And the answer was yes. Everyone has at least mild post-traumatic stress. I've talked about this in a previous video, because even things like when your parents get divorced when you're a kid, or when you change schools and lose all your friends when you're a kid, that can cause mild post-traumatic stress or more. And so some of these roles you've heard of: the scapegoat, the golden child, the pleaser, the caretaker, the one who worries or overfunctions. We kind of can sense when we feel uncomfortable, and when we're uncomfortable around maybe certain family situations still aren't comfortable, or you've had to distance yourself from family, and that these roles are parts. They're parts that kept us safe. So these can be integrated in parts therapy, or, as I mentioned, EDMR or brain spotting. Sometimes talk therapy can really help, but sometimes talk therapy itself just can't quite get deep enough to help us integrate all these parts. And all these parts can get us stuck and going in circles, and maybe we get stuck somewhere in a stage instead of progressing through a stage. Or if we're at a sensitive stage like stage green, where we value inner work, this might involve a lot of what feels like and is heavy lifting, depending on how strong the dysfunction was in your family of origin. But green and beyond also relishes inner work. And while inner work can be really difficult, for stage green and beyond, sometimes they think it's quite fun, because of the miracle of successfully integrating parts, and how good that feels, and how much relief it brings, and how we begin to heal our past. It feels miraculous even to people who really value inner work and appreciate the process. Again, can be very hard, and I always recommend going to a professional, not toughing it out on your own. It is just so much more supportive and helpful and useful and effective to see a qualified professional. And sometimes we have parents where their approval was short-lived, or maybe they were even disapproving. So, we might not appreciate ourselves, and we can feel these parts. And when we go to parts work, we start off and we maybe feel something vague, and we talk our way through it, and the feeling increases, and we can start to name these inner parts. Maybe you have an inner parental construct where that inner parental construct is disapproving. And you want to really, first of all, understand, it bears repeating, this is how the human psyche works. Everybody has parts. Nobody's more or less than because they have more parts to work on, or less intensity with their parts. It just is all part of the human experience, and we've all experienced pain and suffering to varying degrees at different times in our life. Things happen, external things happen, where we might be traumatized by something other than our childhood, and we need to reach out for those professional resources. And one thing that we're doing in the later stages, especially late orange on, green on, is we're deeply individuating. Maybe as a child we came from a family where our inner compass was sort of negated, and our inner values maybe were minimized, or we told our wants and needs or our interests weren't worthy or worth pursuing, but our body tells us they are. And as we become more embodied and more sensitive to our body and our embodiment in stage green, we start to reclaim our interests and our deep authenticity. We can reclaim these at any stage, especially if we reach out for professional help. I can't emphasize that enough, especially if you relish inner work as a lifestyle. Reaching out to a counselor or psychotherapist or someone who's really qualified makes such a profound difference than just reading a self-help book here or touching on some video you watched and trying to do the inner work yourself. Of course, do all of that, but really, professional help, I've probably said it 3, 4, 5 times now, is the key to efficacy. It is the key to really reaping the benefits. And as we get into these later stages, past stage green, into yellow, and even turquoise, all of this parts work is helping us move through these stages, helping us to become more peaceful, and it's helping us to stabilize in these higher peaceful states of beingness. So regardless of, whether your childhood was mildly dysfunctional from a mildly dysfunctional family or very dysfunctional, this psychological work, this radical self-responsibility we take, eventually helps us come into the calm, or deep in the calm, deep in the peace, deep in the stillness that we might want from our spirituality. So I hope you found this content useful. Sending you love and blessings, and see you in the next video.